start in the setup window for Pjc. You define default settings, numbering, and options here. The Company tab displays the company name and address entered in the company profile in Common Services. It also contains fields for a contact name, telephone and fax number specific for a Pjc contact person. On the Settings page, you define Pjc terminology and default calculation methods. First, the names and plurals of Pjc levels are defined. These are the names of each level used for grouping tasks and entering estimates. This allows you to customize Pjc to your specific terminology. Here are a few examples. In construction, a company has been hired to build a house. The house itself would be the first level in Pjc. But the house has many different tasks that need to be completed and billed as the house is being built. For example, excavating, pouring the foundation, framing, drywalling, roofing, painting. These would be the second levels in Pjc. Finally, for each of these tasks, the company uses different resources or incurs different types of costs to complete each task. For excavating, for example, there may be employees that operate equipment, materials that are used to excavate, and even subcontractors for different aspects of the excavation. These would be the third levels in Pjc. Construction companies typically use a job, phase, category terminology for these levels. In a research and development scenario, let's say that a company has been hired to conduct studies on a particular medication. The medication itself could be the first level. Under that would be each of the studies that need to be conducted, such as dosage strengths, lab studies, health properties, composition tests. These would be the second levels. Finally, as with the construction example, there are employees, equipment, materials, subcontractors, and other costs that are incurred. These would be the third level. Terminology varies for each level in this environment, but based on the example, the terms could be product, study, and category. The default names for these levels in Pjc are, as listed here, contracts, projects, and categories. Estimates are entered at the category level. If you change the names here, the new names are used on the data entry windows and in reports. The default labor type is used to calculate the labor burden, or the allocation of additional costs incurred for employees. There are three options. If you select none, the labor burden is not allocated to projects. If you select flat rate per labor hour unit, the rate field is named labor rate. You enter a dollar amount for the labor burden associated with each labor hour per unit produced. If you select percentage of labor cost, the rate field is named labor percentage. You enter the percentage of your fixed costs that represent the labor burden to allocate. The overhead type refers to the overhead burden, or the allocation of indirect costs associated with projects. There are three options. If you select none, the overhead burden is not allocated to projects. If you select flat rate per unit, the rate field is named overhead rate. You enter a dollar amount for the overhead burden associated with each unit cost incurred. If you select percentage of cost, the rate field is named overhead percentage. You enter the percentage of your fixed costs that represent the overhead burden to allocate. The Force Listing of Transactions option will force you to print transaction listings before you post. The default accounting method determines the default calculation method of recognizing costs and revenue on projects. There are several different accounting methods to choose from, including various percent complete methods, billings and costs, accrual basis, and completed project. Each of these methods impact how the revenue recognition process is performed. Percent complete, billings and costs, and completed project accounting methods affect work in progress and billings accounts, with costs and revenues eventually moving to sales and cost of sales accounts at different times. Accrual basis only impacts revenue and cost of sales accounts. For the percent complete calculation methods, the last field on the settings page is used to specify when to clear the billings and work in progress accounts for projects. You can leave balances until project completion, or you can clear during each revenue recognition process. Basic style allows you to enter estimates at the category level. For example, 50 hours of labor, 20 units of material, and so on. The standard style allows you to be more specific in your estimate entry by allowing you to enter estimates at the resource level. For example, employee employee A will spend 10 hours on a task, employee B will spend 5 hours, 5 units of material A will be used, and 10 units of material B, and so on. The default contract style determines the default level for estimate entry when establishing contracts. The default AR item number allows you to define a default item number to be used for projects and categories that are billed on an item invoice. These items are not inventory control items. The default here comes from AR item setup. Depending on the item number selected, you can then select the default unit of measure for that item. The aging periods define 5 aging periods for classifying documents as current and overdue on reports. The segments page is where you define the segments you use for contract numbers and structures, and to indicate whether to use a validation table for each segment. You can define up to 5 different segments for contract numbers. You can define a default contract structure here as well. For this company, contract numbers are broken down by sector, product, and type. You can select here the segment separators that can be used in contract numbers. Once you say no to a segment separator, you cannot reset this option to yes. Based on the segments and separators defined here, you can then create contract numbers to define which segments are used for different contract numbers. The Transactions page allows you to define document numbering sequences for each transaction type entered in Pjc, and indicates the next posting sequence for these transaction types. It also lets you specify a source for the default unit cost and billing rate used on timecard transactions for employees. The Integration page allows you to specify the information that is sent to the description and comment fields when Pjc sends invoices to AR. You also have the option to automatically post AR invoice batches that are created by Pjc. Let's take a look at cost types.